Hello and welcome back. I'm now talking about when TUPE doesn't apply. So modules 1 and 2 dealt with situations where TUPE applied. Module 1 was the traditional business transfer, the transfer of an economic entity retaining its identity. Module 2 was dealing with service provision changes. In this module, we're going to look at a few exceptions, in particular, service provision changeovers, which are for the supply of goods or for short-term arrangements. Share sales is another exception. Public authorities is a third exception, and some transfers abroad are a fourth. TUPE will not apply where a business simply changes its suppliers. A transfer has to involve the supply of services. It's a service provision changeover, as well as goods. So if a restaurant changes its grocery suppliers, TUPE won't apply, and employees won't transfer from the original grocery supplier to the new supplier. Nor will TUPE apply to service provision changeovers, which are either for a single event or for a short-term task. Now, this is designed to avoid TUPE applying when a business buys in services for a one-off event like a conference or an exhibition. But whether TUPE applies to a single event also depends on how long the contract will last. For example, a big event like the Olympic Games back in 2012 might have several different security contracts. One contract might deal with the provision of ongoing security advice for several years leading up to the Games. Another contract might provide for security staff to protect athletes during the event itself. Both contracts are one-off because they relate to the one-off event of the Olympic Games. The first is much longer though, and would be subject to TUPE if the contractors changed partway through the delivery of the contract. The second contract is both one-off and short-term, and so TUPE wouldn't apply. TUPE doesn't apply to share sales. There's no transfer of a business from one person to another when a company is taken over in a share sale. The legal identity of the employer doesn't change. The employer is still Widgets Limited. Just because the owners of Widgets Limited have changed doesn't take away from the fact that the employer is still Widgets Limited and the identity of the employer does not change. For there to be a TUPE transfer, there's got to be a change of identity of the employer. So when there's a share sale, TUPE does not apply because the employees continue to be employed by the same organisation. TUPE does not apply to transfers of public administrative functions within public authorities. And that's because the exercise of public powers isn't considered to be an economic activity. If administrative functions are transferred from one local authority to another, TUPE does not apply, although under something called the Cabinet Office Guidelines, similar rules are applied in practice. But TUPE can apply to the transfer of staff carrying out economic activities in the public sector. For example, cleaning and maintenance services don't involve the exercise of any public power and are economic activities. So cleaning and maintenance services which transfer from one public authority to another could be covered by TUPE. TUPE also applies to transfers from the public sector to the private sector. This usually involves the outsourcing of activities previously done by local authorities such as rubbish collection or care services. It's a service provision change from a local authority to a private contractor. Transfers abroad are a little tricky. TUPE potentially applies to the transfer of a business from the UK to another country, especially where the contracts of employment say that UK law applies. TUPE simply says it applies to relevant transfers if the undertaking or the service provision changes if the undertaking were based in the UK. So in a case called Hollis Metal Industries against GMB the union, the Employment Appeal Tribunal confirmed that TUPE potentially applied when a company sold part of its UK manufacturing business to a company in Israel, which moved the manufacturing function over to Israel. The Employment Appeal Tribunal decided that since the purpose of TUPE was to protect the rights of workers in the event of changes of employer, The better approach is to make sure those employees are protected even if the transfer is outside the borders of the European Union. Now, many companies are choosing to outsource services like call centres to other countries where costs are lower. But the situation is complicated. Let's take the sale of a UK business to a company in the Philippines. If TUPE applies, employees transfer on current terms, including their place of work. But if the new company doesn't need staff in the UK, there's a place of work redundancy situation. The new company might offer alternative employment, but it would be on local, less attractive terms. Most employees would prefer redundancy to employment abroad on those terms. Most would also prefer the UK employer made any redundancies before the transfer to avoid having to pursue a foreign company for payments, or indeed pursue the National Insurance Fund or the Redundancy Payments Office. For these reasons, there are few cases on the issue. Businesses have to ensure they understand any TUPE obligations which apply to the transfers abroad, and normally it's worth seeking specialist advice on how to protect the business against potential liabilities in this situation. Hopefully the building blocks of a TUPE transfer are now a bit easier to understand. The principles relating to business transfers and service provision changes are based on the same things: a change of employer, the transfer of an ongoing active business, and a business activity which looks pretty much the same before and after the transfer. Employers should generally assume that TUPE applies in these business scenarios. As case law has shown, the facts will establish whether TUPE applies, rather than employers deciding between themselves. Now, in Module 4, we start getting into the meat of the impact of TUPE, looking at the automatic transfer principle. I'll see you there.